Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And I would like to apologize for the background noise today. At the office, and there is no power, so everyone has got his generator on, and it can be a bit disturbing. So, thank you again for joining us on Subjects Media. Subjects Media is a platform that bridges the gap between community impact and climate news. The purpose of this platform is to be able to amplify the voices and works of vulnerable people. Within Search Africa, we have four initiatives. There is an article submission portal where anyone, especially people from the global south, can have an outlet or a pathway to the media and access where they can be able to submit media content, usually in form of private stories, information, or research data. So the idea of this submission portal is to be able to cut down media barrier that has largely pushed back voices and works of young people from the global south. The second initiative is advocacy journalism, within which we have this program today. So advocacy journalism are trainings on how to write about environmental and social justice issues to influence change. So most of the time, people have amazing stories and people do want their voices to be heard, but they might not necessarily have this tool to structure their stories in the way that might have the power to influence change. So this is what advocacy journalism sessions are about, to give people the necessary skills to strengthen their writing capacity. And the third initiative is Hear Me Now. Hear Me Now are visual campaigns that give global southern activists, climate advocates visibility in mainstream media. Again, this particular campaign is aimed out at just showcasing works of young people because we have lots of amazing young people doing great work on ground, but most of the times their works are not really acknowledged. So Hear Me Now is aimed at doing just that, to make sure that these works get out there, to make sure that people acknowledge that there are lots of young people doing amazing work that should be recognized. So the last one is The Untold. The Untold are visual stories about people and communities across Africa who are impacted by climate change. So with this, it's a form of docu-series where we tell stories of communities affected by climate change. But this time we're telling it from the lens of these people using story-based approach so that it comes from their perspective and so that we tell it in a way that carries that message of change. Um, so Subjects Media incorporates advocacy journalism to deliberately situate and influence climate media that carries perspective of people of color. The key premise of this approach is to actively champion ideas and values that take into account different narratives by understanding diversity, beliefs, culture, and socioeconomy to advocate for the need for climate resilience in a non-biased manner. So essentially, we just want to be able to put out perspective of people of color so that people truly get to see us from our own perspective, the way that we want to see us through our culture, through our diversity, and through our belief, not that watered down Western narrative that is being put out there. So today our session would be ecological justice. Our instructor is Gopal. Gopal has been involved in fighting for social and economic, environmental, and racial justice since the 90s. So that's basically way before I was born. Amazing. So he's the co-founder of Movement Generation, a justice and ecology project where he inspires and engages in transformative action towards the liberation and restoration of land, labor, and culture. So while we are at introducing Gopal, I just want to say that the first time that I had Gopal speak, I felt that he really spoke truth into my existence. I mean, I've had been to lots of events that have cycled discussions around, neocolonialism, destructive extractivism, but I've never really had anyone speak the way that he does. It just makes sense. Everything makes sense when he says it. I don't want to say too much, but I'm just going to give the floor to Gopal. And thank you very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to listen to your session. If you can take over.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for having me. I think I need permission to share my video.
I have no idea.
Okay.
Trying
It
to,
says
because if you are a panelist, I think
okay.
you should be able to. You don't see a control for share screen?
I can share my screen. I just can't show my face, but that's okay. I can share the screen. Oh no, it says I can't share my screen either. It says host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
So would you mind if you quickly send me your presentation? I think I can share it.
I can try. I think it might be very big. Let me see if I can send it to you. I think it might be too big. But I think if you as the host, you should be able to.
I think I can make you a co-host. Hold on a second.
Yeah, I think if you do that, it should work.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. Yeah, I've just made you a co-host, so you can do that.
Wonderful. That has worked. There we go. And yeah, now I can share my screen. Hello, everyone. My name is Gopal Dayaneni. Thank you so much, Nasreen, for inviting me to join you. It's a great pleasure to be able to share with you all as activists and journalists and writers. And I'm looking forward to our time together. Just a little bit of background. I'm going to share a little bit of how I try to set larger meta frames. So this is the sort of largest way I try to frame issues of climate ecology and social justice. And I always work to put it in both historical and contemporary context. So I'm going to share a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to do a very short sort of presentation on story-based strategy and talk particularly about how we can think of story-based strategy in the context of climate disruption. And I'm really excited to share with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen. And with that, and I'm going to also invite if anyone wants to add a comment or something to the chat, I'll do my best to keep track of it. But if I don't, it's also okay to interrupt me, and we'll have time at the end for questions and comments. Okay, because of the way the webinar works, if I might ask some questions, and you may have to type your comments into the chat, because I don't think maybe participants are muted. So before I start, I'm going to talk a little bit about ecological justice and transformative narratives. And before I do that, I want to just do a little bit of like an overarching theme. So, I'm talking about ecological justice, ecology. When we talk about climate change and ecology, I think the Zoom, something happened with the Zoom here. Hold on. I'm not sure what happened. It looks like my my screen sharing stopped for a second. Hold on. Let's see. Sorry, my screen sharing appeared to have stopped.
It's okay. Take your time.
Okay. I think this should work. Okay. So when we talk about ecology, ecosystems, economy, we're all it's all rooted in a very a very simple starting point, which is this this idea of eco. So I want to start by just asking, do people know what eco, like an ecosystem or ecology, means? If you have an idea, you can just type it into the chat. Does anybody have an idea of what that word actually means and where it comes from? Somebody put in human. Yeah. Interestingly enough, yes, Anna has it correct. Eco actually means home. It comes from the Greek oikos, which is where actually a whole bunch of words that I'm going to talk about that we use in English come from. Eco actually means home. People often think it means environment, but it literally means home. An ecosystem, the word system actually means relationships or together. And so ecosystem is actually the relationships of home. And this is really important because an ecosystem is not a catalog of all the living and non-living things in a place. An ecosystem is defined by the relationships between living things. It is the relationships of home. And an ecosystem can be as large as the entire planet or as small as a drop of water. It just simply depends on where you draw the boundaries of home. And I think this is a super, super important and grounding concept. Because when we hear the word ecology or ecosystem, we tend to think about the environment and we tend to separate it from ourselves. But instead, we should think of it in a much more foundational way. We should think of it as the relationships of home. And if an ecosystem is the relationships of home, then what is an economy? Anybody know what the nomi part means? It also comes from the Greek, and it means management. So economy simply means management of home. It does not mean buying and selling. It does not mean GDP. It does not mean jobs. It does not mean money. It does not mean trade. It does not mean debt. Those are just some of the ways in which we describe or some of the elements of the current dominant economy. But economy simply means management of home. And this is really important because if you have ever cooked food for a friend who was sick, or dropped what you were doing and went and picked up your friend's children from school or from somewhere and took them where they needed to be, or if you've ever stopped on the walking down the street to help somebody who needed help, that's all management of home, even though it is not counted or valued in the dominant extractive economy. And it is important to remember that in the thousands of years, the hundreds of thousands of years that we've been basically the way we are, for the vast majority of time humanity has been on the planet, we have managed our home in relationship to the ecosystems upon which we depend as part of those ecosystems. And it is only in a very tiny sliver of time that we have mismanaged home at the scale and pace that has created the level of climate disruption that we experience today. And if you globalize the economy, you globalize the ecosystem. And if you mismanage home, the consequences become epic, like planetary scale, which is the disturbance of the atmosphere. And I want you to remember that there isn't ever just one economy. We are all participating in lots of different ways of managing home all the time. And actually, interestingly enough, the notion of the economy, the word the being put in front of the word economy, only happened in the 1940s and 50s as part of the rise of the neoliberal project. And it was the idea that the economy is something separate from you and you watch it happening. or you are just, it's just this like self-managing phenomenon. But it used to be that economy was something that we all participated in every day. And the word economy meant more like thrift or daily management of home. It is important to note that all economies are nested in ecosystems. There is no economy without an ecological basis. You can't have an economy without ecosystems, because all wealth comes from the work of the living world. It's human labor combined with the labor of the living world in the form of trees or soil or plants or minerals that then together make value. And that value then is what we engage with in the management of home. So all economies are nested in ecosystems, and all human communities engage in economy. And this is really important because you will only ever experience the living world through the economy that you are in. This is why there is no such thing as a natural disaster. What do I mean by there's no such thing as a natural disaster? A 4.5 earthquake in California, where I live, will rattle the dishes and maybe wake you up in the middle of the night. But a 4.5 earthquake in Bangladesh could collapse a sweatshop and kill 1,000 people. Because while the earthquake might be a natural phenomenon, we will only experience it as it travels through the economy. And an inequitable economy will inequitably distribute the consequences. It is true for climate change. It is true for an earthquake. It's true for the pandemic. We will only experience it as it travels through the economy, and an unfair economy will unfairly distribute the consequences. Because economies are always nested inside living systems. And we only experience living systems through the economy. Your relationship to the soil outside of your house is whether it is paved over or not. Okay, here's a couple more eco words. Ecology, that's an easy one. Logi, most people know, means knowledge or study. So ecology is the knowledge or study of home. I'm going to give you a few more real quick. Ecotone. Do folks know what tone means? Anyone have a guess? You want to throw an idea of what tone means in the chat? This is a little bit harder one. We tend to think of tone as something associated with music. Ah, look, Khalid, I think we might have a couple of ecologists in the room. Yeah, the gap between biomes, that's very close. Pitch, we think of it in music in terms of pitch. Tone actually means tension. That's what creates pitch, right? That's what creates different, when you tighten a string, you get a different sound. So ecotone means tension, the tensions of home. And it is true, it's not quite the gap between biomes, it's where two biotic communities meet. Because there isn't actually a gap, there's an overlap, there's an edge. So all ecosystems have an edge and an interior. And where those edges meet, you have overlapping you have ecotone. And that ecotone is kind of the interesting space because there's, in all of those edges, you have interactions that are uncommon to the interior. And then, and because of that, in those interactions, in that complexity, you get the greatest amount of diversity. The greater the edge, the greater the diversity. We experience this. We experience the overlap from ecotone in human communities because the greater the ecological and biotic diversity, the greater the human ethnic and cultural diversity you'll experience. Which is why, for example, in the Niger Delta, you have so many different languages and cultures and communities, which is why in the tropics, where you are bombarded with regular and intense solar radiation from the sun, and you have the greatest amount of of plant diversity, you also have the greatest amount of linguistic diversity. Because the more ecotone you have, the more diversity you get, the more diversity you get, the more biotic diversity you get, the more cultural diversity you get. What's interesting is in Western and some of the Western ecological sciences, like marine ecology, they tell you to stay away from the edge effect. Like if you start to examine the edge, the complexity makes it hard to make simple reductionist observations about what's happening. When in fact the edge is some of the most exciting and interesting place because that's where you see the greatest complexity. And ecological, if the ecology is the knowledge of home, ecological is the applied knowledge of home. And as I mentioned, we're going to start on ecological justice, so I quickly want to note that then if ecological is the applied knowledge of home, then ecological justice is the applied knowledge of home, the study of home towards justice. And then the question is, what is justice? And I would quote Dr. Cornel West, who says, justice is what love looks like in public. Literally, like what is the policy, the infrastructure, the institutions, the social systems that we create that becomes the shared public manifestation of love, of caring, of sacredness, of compassion. That is what we seek. Okay, I did that because I wanted to really just set a basic kind of meta frame for us about how I try to not just accept the conventional definitions. I know that somebody noted, Adam Smith says that economy is the study of money, and I'm actually interested in getting folks to like liberate their imaginations from the conventional notions of things, and to embrace the fact that we can make new meaning. So most people, when they think of ecosystems, they think of something out there that you observe or watch on a nature TV show. And when people think of economy, they think of jobs and money and debt and trade and GDP and all of these conventional things that we're told about. But we can actually reimagine that. And in fact, it's not even about reimagining, it's about remembering that for the vast, vast majority of us, only 2 generations ago, or even 1 generation ago, we lived a totally different way. And the imposition of a particular kind of economy on our communities is brand new. And we should remind ourselves of that and remember that. Okay, but we're here to talk a little bit specifically about climate. So I know everybody knows this because everybody is here by choice to work on these issues, but how did we get into this situation where we've disturbed the atmosphere? We've disturbed planetary systems at a scale in which we are experiencing a disturbance in the carbon cycle, the hydrologic cycle, and in generally the Earth's metabolisms. And it starts very simply, and we all know this, that at some point, some people figured out that there was this incredibly powerful, extremely flexible, highly abundant resource that if you extract it from its rightful place in living systems, concentrate control of it, and unleash its potential, you could transform everything about everything in the world. I mean, I wouldn't have my phone or this Zoom call without it. We wouldn't, it's in my, we wouldn't have the coffee mug without it. We wouldn't have this pen without it. Everything about us is now dependent on the exploitation of this particular resource, and that it's at the heart of what creates the climate crisis, and at the heart of what has created the superstorms and the wildfires and the desertification. It's the extraction and exploitation of this particular resource. And what is it? What is that resource? Do you think you know? And put it in the chat. Oil, fossil fuels, crude oil, hydrocarbons, fossil fuels. No, actually, it's human labor. Because in order to exploit this pool of carbon, coal or oil or gas, you have to exploit this pool of carbon first. This is how we got here, from exploiting the pool of carbon that really matters. Human labor and the labor of the rest of the living world. From the enslaved black bodies that terraformed the south of the United States, and the black bodies that worked the coal mines in South Africa, to the oil fields and oil spills in Nigeria, to the war we wage every single day on the microbial life in the soil. That is what creates the climate crisis, because you cannot blow up a mountain for coal or dig a mile deep hole in the ground for coal, or put an offshore oil, dozens or hundreds of offshore oil rigs off the coast, the Gulf Coast of the United States or in the Niger Delta, without first controlling the land and labor to do it. Because mountains don't blow themselves up. And people don't blow up their own mountains unless they are required to do it. So that it is absolutely essential in thinking about, talking about, and framing climate disruption to remember it is insufficient to look up at the atmosphere and count carbon. You have to look down at the economy, at the exploitation of land and labor, and the erosion of seed and of soil and of story, of cultures and cosmologies, of worldviews, of ways of knowing. So the first and most important thing I want you to take from this whole thing is that social inequity is a form of ecological imbalance. It is an imbalance in the relationships of home and will inherently result in ecological erosion. This is really important. Another way to say this is what you do to the land, you do to the people, and what you do to the people, you do to the land. And so on the left here is a picture from the 2019 Ondo oil field fire in Niger Delta, and on the right is an older picture from an organization I used to work for called Project Underground, of protests in Opia and Ikenyan in 2000 after the burning of villages, after oil platform occupations. What you do to the land, you do to the people. What you do to the people, you do to the land. You can see this everywhere all the time as you look around. And I want to just in this context just really note that the idea that talking about climate change is only being about fossil fuels sets the starting point of the problem with the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of coal, oil, and gas as primary fuel sources. Erasing the fact that the Industrial Revolution could not have happened without the colonization, without a Western imperial colonization of Africa, of the Americas, of the world, and the enslavement of Black bodies that was brought to the Americas, that created all of the wealth of all of the corporations of all of the world. There's a famous quote that says, every drop of blood extracted from the slave master's whip is worth more than all the wealth of all the corporations in the world, and there were rivers of blood. We wouldn't be here if we aren't here simply because of the Industrial Revolution. We are here because of a legacy of settler colonialism and enslavement, and that continued legacy of imposing particular modes of economy, development, culture, language on peoples in the planet. Okay. A next key theme, because of limited time, I wanted to just cover a few key points. So I hope folks can stick with me for this. I see Yusuf wrote, there won't be social justice unless there's environmental justice. Yes, and there cannot be environmental justice unless there's social justice. So one of the most important contributions of the environmental justice movement was to actually redefine the environment. To redefine the environment as not just being something that's out there that you observe or that you go to enjoy, or but that the environment is where we live, work, play, learn, and worship. That all the places that we live our lives is the environment. And in that context, environmental justice, and from my perspective, ecological justice, justice in how we apply our knowledge of our relationships at home, covers the gamut from policing and prisons and politics all the way through to the climate crisis. These are all related phenomena. Okay, something important as climate journalists or climate writers to remember, that the scale of the problem does not dictate the scale of the solutions. What is this? What do I mean by this? One of the ways that we think about climate disruption, the way we talk about climate disruption, is we talk about it at the planetary scale. We talk about mean atmospheric temperature rise. We talk about atmospheric concentrations of CO2. Even as we talk about the impacts, we tend to talk about them in broad planetary scales. When we talk about tipping points, like the burning of the Amazon rainforest, the loss of the Amazon rainforest is a tipping point that could lead to runaway warming, or the loss of summer ice in the Arctic, or the calving of the Greenland. We talk about these things in terms of planetary tipping points, right? So the scale, so the way we talk about the scale of the problem then leads us in our imagination to think that if it's a planetary scale problem, then we need planetary scale solutions. But the scale of the problem does not actually dictate the scale of the solutions, right? And I'll explain why. So two things. First, so this is a picture of, of a fanciful imagining of one form of solar geoengineering, which would be to put satellite mirrors in space to reflect the sun's light. The more common solar geoengineering schemes include things like stratospheric aerosol injection of particulates so that we can block out the sun's radiation, right? So the planetary scale, it is true that the scale of the problem is now planetary, but that doesn't mean the solutions should be thought of only in terms of the United Nations has to come up with a planetary scale answer, or we need technologies that operate at a planetary scale. Instead, we should understand that the cause of the planetary scale crisis, like climate disruption, is the emergent consequence of exploiting communities and screwing up ecosystems everywhere on the planet at once. It is the emergent consequence of a different problem, which is a problem that is happening at a very local scale, or at a smaller scale, at the level of economic activity. So let's go back to tipping points for a second. you can imagine, and you talk about it at a planetary scale, you say, if we lose 40 or 50% of the Amazon rainforest, we'll hit a tipping point and it will continue to burn until it turns into a savanna. It goes from a biodiverse intact rainforest into a savanna. That's the way of talking about the tipping point in terms of climate science and planetary climate thinking. But if you are an indigenous person in the Amazon, the very first bulldozer to take out the very first tree, to put in the very first road for the very first exploratory oil well is the end of your way of life. And if we think of the tipping point and we devolve power and decision-making to the level of the communities, we don't get anywhere near that planetary scale problem. It is by railroading those communities, it is through the violence of extractivism that you get to the place where you have a planetary scale crisis. If communities in the Niger Delta, if communities throughout, I speak of Nigeria a lot only because I have the experience of working with activists in Nigeria for many years, but anywhere in the world, anywhere in Africa, if communities have control over the decisions, and if communities govern their own economies, you are less likely to find yourself at the scale of exploitation, resource extraction that you see today. So the scale of the problem does not dictate the scale of the solutions. The scale of the solutions have to add up to the scale of the problem, of course, right? But we can do that by aggregating the solutions, not by thinking of one big solution, but by aggregating solutions. So for example, the La Via Campesina, the international peasant movement, has an expression, small farmers cool the planet, or agroecology cools the planet. Whether it's climate change or global hunger, the solution to the erosion of soil, the degradation of soil, and the problem of hunger and starvation is not a globalized industrial food system. It is in agroecology and peasant agriculture. So the problem might be planetary in scale, but we can see that there is a global problem of hunger. But the solution is actually local, decentralized, and small scale that aggregates. And it turns out, like, important to note, this is like something that's really important for journalists and writers and activists to note. 80% of the world's population gets its food needs met through peasant and subsistence agriculture, which accounts for only 25% of the arable land on the planet, while only 20% of the world is fed by industrial agriculture, which controls 75% of the arable land on the planet. So it is not the case that industrial, genetically modified, chemical intensive, machine intensive, labor exploiting agriculture actually feeds the world's population. And that is because it does not grow food, it mines for calories. Okay. I'm going to go to the, I'm going to actually just share a very quick, another framework, a way to think about this, and then I'm going to do this super quickly, but I just want to share a way of thinking about solutions, especially around climate. So this is what you're looking at here is something we call the 3 circles tool, or 3 circle strategy. And it's the idea that there are real solutions, false promises, and what's politically possible in any given arena of struggle. I'm not going to go over this whole thing, but I just want to note this idea that for one of the biggest issues around climate and climate disruption right now is that we should not waste our time as journalists or even as activists trying to argue that climate change is real. Everybody actually knows that climate change is real. Even people who are denying climate change, the primary reason why politicians and officials and corporations are denying climate change is because they understand something that even most activists don't understand, which is if you accept that it is real and you understand that it is caused by the economy, then everything about the economy has to change. Climate denial is not about denying whether climate change is real. It's about denying whether or not we should do anything about it, because the consequences are consequences that people who have benefited from the exploitation that caused climate change will lose. So the debate now is not over whether climate change is real or not real. The debate is over what will the solutions be. Will it be geoengineering or will it be peasant agriculture? Will it be local, living, resilient economies, or will it be genetic engineering and microbial factories? Will it be reducing emissions at the source of pollution, or will it be carbon capture and sequestration? Will it be actually controlling corporate activity, or will it be trading in pollution? The debate is not over whether climate change is real. The debate is actually about what we're going to do about it. And constantly pointing out that climate change is real isn't helping us right now, because there is a battle over real solutions versus false promises, things that claim to solve the problem, but actually don't. And I just want to offer very quickly a simple framework. When you hear someone talk about a climate solution, whether it's a technology, whether it's a policy, ask yourself, does it address the root causes? Does it democratize the economy and governance? Is it part of a diverse set of solutions, or does it think there's one solution for everything? Is it decentralized? Is it something that communities can engage with and that creates power in local communities? Does it decolonize? Does it move us away from Western industrial colonial mind frames, linear narratives of conquest versus spiral narratives of interdependence? And does it reduce and redistribute resources towards greater equity? That's my criteria for a solution. So solar panels to me are not a solution. Community control of clean energy systems through energy democracy, that's a solution. So it's not about the technology, it's about the governance, the scale, the community control. And how do you know something's a false solution? Just ask yourself two simple questions. Does it concentrate, control, and increase the erosion of seed, of soil, and of story? Is it expanding concentration and control, or is it decreasing concentration and control? Or you can ask yourself, does it exacerbate existing social and environmental problems, or does it create new social and environmental problems? Because if it does, then it's not helping us. Because quite frankly, you cannot dam all the rivers thinking that you're going to deal with climate change by not having fossil fuel. You can't sell out the rivers for the atmosphere. The planet doesn't work that way. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about narratives. Okay. I'm going to try and go quickly. I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but I also started a few minutes late, so hopefully I can go a few minutes over. This is a quote by a person named Wayne Dyer that I really like. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So what are we looking at here? What do people see? What is that? Does anybody know what that is? Anybody want to say, type in the chat, what are we looking at here? What is that? Anybody know what that is? The constellation, the stars. What constellation is that? Yep, it's a star constellation. What is it called? It's some people call it Ursa Major. It's also called the Big Dipper. Yeah, there we go, Khalid. It's the Big Dipper. Yeah. Is there actually a Big Dipper in the sky, like a big ladle, a big spoon in the sky? No, actually, there's not, right? It's in fact, those stars are really, really far apart, not only in space but also in time. And the light is reaching us onto the canvas of our minds, and we connect the dots, and we draw a picture, and we tell a story. And we make meaning of the world through the stories we tell. Human beings are narrative animals. We make meaning of the world through story, through metaphor. And what's important here is that the currency of narrative is not fact, but meaning. That is to say, that just giving people facts will not make it meaningful to them. It has to connect to their life, to their lived experience. It has to tell the story itself has to be a way that people can make meaning of their world. So it's important to remember that narrative is about meaning making, not about fact telling. And the problem with most climate journalism, even progressive climate journalism, is it simply seeks to tell facts. And facts do not actually change the way people make meaning of the world, by and large. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we do help people make meaning of the world. I want to note that I said, we look at the sky and we connect dots, right? And when I say humans are narrative animals, there are many, many ways that we have made meaning of the world through narrative. So here's another looking up at the sky. And what you're looking at here, most people might look at that and say, oh, that's the Milky Way. That's looking through the Milky Way. In Aboriginal cosmologies from Australia, they see the great emu in the sky. And what's interesting about this constellation, it is not made by connecting the dots. It is made by looking at the empty space and making meaning out of the empty space. So even the example I gave of the Big Dipper tells a story, and the way I describe it is a story of linear thinking, of connecting dots in this linear way to draw a picture. When in fact, most peoples on the planet, for most of the time we've been on the planet, have made meaning in vastly different ways. And for me, it's like, wow, imagine the sky so filled with stars that you have to make your stories out of the empty space. That to me is a really powerful example of like the diversity of ways that we make meaning. We see the world through narrative glasses. I'm going to just do a couple of things really quick here. What are we looking at? That's a map of the world. And in the interest of time, I'm going to talk through these. What do we remember as we were growing up about the definition of a continent? Well, we probably were told that a continent is a large landmass surrounded by a body of water. South America is a large landmass surrounded by a body of water. North America is a large landmass surrounded by a body of water. Africa, Australia, Asia is a large landmass surrounded by a body of water. But there's Europe. Europe is not a large landmass surrounded by a body of water. Why does Europe get to be a continent? Well, Europe gets to be a continent because Europeans made the map. And in fact, why does the map always look like this? We're actually just a big rock floating in the infinite vacuum of space. And it turns out that this notion of what's called the upside down map, right, is has real political consequences. The design of the map as right side up had real political consequences, because research shows that the north-south positions on maps have psychological consequences. North is associated with richer people, more expensive real estate, higher altitude, while south is associated with poor people, cheap prices, low altitude. It's called the north-south bias. An activist artist created this south-up map, an Uruguayan artist, created this south-up map to disturb people's understandings of how the planet has to look. Right? Let's be clear that the definition of a continent is arbitrary and is in large part, is in large part arbitrary, and the people who drew the map get to create the definition. And the map that we use is the colonial map. So the word narrative literally means it's the root of narrative is in knowing. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit quickly here because I want to leave time for more questions. So framing is what you strategically decide to leave in and leave out of a particular story. How is a story framed? So this is a really this is an example from, of course, that when there is a quote unquote terrorist attack in Europe, like in Paris, the entire world's attention is placed on it. But when the daily violence waged with dollars from the West throughout the South and East, whether it's the Middle East or Africa, that's not viewed as terrorism. That's not included in the frame. And so we talk about it in terms of the absence of, what we choose to include in the story determines how people understand the story. And this really matters. These are two pictures from the same day. One is Associated Press and one is AFP, both on the same day, both from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And the caption on the left, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And the one on the right, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. What is the difference between these two pictures? The person on the left is black, the people on the right appear to be white. The difference between one person's actions is looting, another person's actions is finding, even though they're doing the same thing. And this really matters because when the National Guard comes to New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, if you're looting, they're coming to shoot you. And if you're finding, they're coming to rescue you. And here, white supremacy and structural whiteness frames the narrative. Okay, I'm going to spend a moment talking about characters. I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to share a little bit about a really important principle in storytelling. Stories have basic elements. There's a conflict, there are characters, there's imagery, there's often foreshadowing, a hint into what the future will be like. And stories are all based on assumptions. You have to have some assumptions to be able to follow a story. And I'm going to focus on characters, but I would love to do sometime a larger narrative strategy training with you all on issues specifically related to Africa. We just recently did a narrative strategy workshop on target malaria and gene drives. We used a very similar, it was like a 2-day workshop. So I'd love to do something like that with you all if it's helpful. But characters are like, who are the messages in the story? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who are the heroes, villains, and victims? Who speaks on behalf of an issue or a story? These things really matter. Who is a credible storyteller? So here is our examples. Again, very similar idea here, but like, in the upper left-hand corner is this guy named Kevin Esvelt, who's a scientist who came up with gene drives. And when you hear about target malaria, the idea of creating genetically engineered mosquitoes that will propagate their genetic modification throughout the wild population in order to drive all of the mosquitoes to extinction. So who gets to speak on behalf of these issues? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? Who are the victims? African peoples are just the victims of malaria. Malaria is the largest killer in Africa. It's children, it's poor people, it's the poor Black people of Africa. Who are the heroes? The scientists, the Western scientists, the saviors, the technologies. Who's the villain? The mosquito is the villain. But when we actually understand the story of malaria, it is a story of colonialism, poverty, of exploitation. And the heroes, the strategic point of intervention in dealing with malaria is actually the uplift of communities, of community control, of so many different ways that we can think about it. Even the single largest, the most important anti-malarial drug on the planet comes from sweet wormwood, which is grown by African farmers, and which is a traditional way of treating malaria. And instead, rich Western interests come in and say that the answer is in this like technology that will solve the problem. Characters really matter. Whose voices are amplified, whose stories are told, who are viewed as sympathetic, who are viewed as credible. Can the audience see themselves in the storytellers? That's how you change a story. And there's so much more we could talk about. We could talk about each of the different elements, but I just wanted to uplift characters. And then I wanted to end with just, this is my last slide, and then I want to open it up for some conversation. I wanted to end with some framing advice on talking about climate. First of all, you might notice that I never use the term climate change. I only ever use the term climate disruption. And that is because climate change sounds like something that's just happening and is inevitable and we don't know any reason why it's happening. Climate disruption speaks to the fact that there is activity that is actually disturbing and disrupting a stable climate. There's greater agency in climate disruption than there is in climate change. So please stop using climate change and start using climate disruption to talk about it. Second point I want to share, do not refer to climate disruption as something that happens in the future. And this is probably less likely for those of you writing in the African context, because we experience in the global South and in poor people in the global North, we experience climate change every day. It's not about the future. It's here now and will continue into the future. It used to be like when Hurricane Katrina happened, you couldn't say that superstorms were caused by climate change because we couldn't make a direct correlationship between the variability of weather and climate disruption. But now we know that actually the severity, intensity, frequency, and damage caused by storms are directly related to the altering of the climate. So we can say that now. When talking about the causes of climate disruption, it is okay to use caused by corporate activity, caused by colonial activity, caused by industrial activity, caused by imperial activity, caused by the activity of the 1%. But do not use the term common in climate parlance, caused by human activity, because it isn't actually everybody's fault. The idea of flattening responsibility to all of humanity is a framing disaster for climate justice forces. Some peoples, some nations, some communities are least responsible for the cause and most likely to experience the consequences, and most severely experience the consequences. And this should be front and center in climate framing. Talking about it as being caused by human activity is inaccurate. Whoops. My last couple of points. Amplify the voices and magnify the visibility of civil society, frontline communities, and grassroots experience. There are lots of different kinds of expertise, and we need to start looking beyond the official validated expertise that Western industrial and corporate interests put forward, like just scientists, just government, and just technologists. And instead, look at what's happening in communities, amplify the voices of everyday people, and of course of civil society and social movements. There's a, you know, if you think about things like tsunamis, many of you have probably heard stories of like entire villages that were in Indonesia, for example, in the islands of Indonesia, who could predict a tsunami coming by their daily observation of the waters and move their entire villages up into the hills to avoid any loss of life. Whereas communities that are entirely dependent on the early warning systems and technologies of science to tell them when a tsunami is coming often experience the greatest amount of damage. It's like, who are you going to trust? People who've been living there for thousands and thousands of years and have learned to observe the ocean, or a computer system based on satellite data? The last two things I want to say. One is, we often, when we talk about climate, and particularly even when we talk about climate justice, we separate communities from ecosystems. Whenever possible, keep those two together in the same frame. Talk about the impacts on living systems and human communities together, so that we break down that separation of humans from nature and humans from ecosystems. Yes, and I see that Yusuf says trust both. Yeah, there's obviously great value to be gained from the method of inquiry that is science. But right now we're in a place where the balance is so off that the voices of communities and of impacted people and the right of communities to express their own agenda about what happens and what doesn't happen is so deeply eroded that needs to be uplifted. Again, target malaria being an example where the people of Burkina Faso are completely left out of the discourse on whether they should or should not be subjected to genetically engineered mosquitoes that will wipe out that will propagate through the wild population. And then the last thing I'll say is the solutions are all around us. Don't just look for the big picture solutions. Don't talk about climate disruption only when it's time for UN meetings, but actually look at the solutions that are around us every day. And let's focus as much on the solutions as we do on the impacts, because the way through this is going to be in the way we reorganize economy and community towards justice and equity. Okay, I will stop there. And I'll open it up for as much time as we have for questions. Thank you so much for putting up with me talking at you.
It was great to listen to you. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. Would you like to check them?
Sure, yeah. How do you engage these unseen equal power dynamics? The polluting state is in bed with the polluting corporate elite. It's a neoliberal nightmare. Yeah, of course. What are your thoughts on green economy under communism, socialism? Are those systems more viable? Okay, one thing, so let me start with the second half first. Khalid, thank you for that. First, I want to say, I like to talk about extractivism, capitalism, so an economy whose sole purpose is the enclosure of wealth and power, the accumulation of capital as its primary purpose, is one form of extractivism. But it's really important to remember that we cannot convert the wealth of the living world into stuff faster than the capacity of living systems to regenerate and get away with it. So resource-intensive industrial production under capitalism, under state communism, in a socialist regime is still going to degrade living systems, and will still at some point, and therefore requires frontiers of extractivism. The problem is, once you degrade one ecosystem, you cannot maintain the wealth or prosperity you gain from degrading the ecosystem without substituting it or degrading another ecosystem. And so this is the self-reinforcing destructive feedback of development as it's defined in by the World Economic Forum, by neoliberalism. It's like everybody is entitled to all of the wealth, and like the promise that you can have the kind of prosperity that that only was achieved through scales of exploitation that none of us think are okay. Like we're all like the issue isn't that everybody should have the standard of living of the United States. The issue is that the United States should not have this standard of living. It was only possible through enslavement and colonialism. And so our job, for me, as somebody in the United States, as an activist and organizer, is to create the conditions by which we are actually disrupting the epicenter of the empire in ways that create opportunities for more local community-based control. So for me, I can think of many different ways of organizing economy and community, and we can see them all around us. I don't think it has to be one way, but the question is our relationship to human labor and the living world based on sacredness and mutually beneficial relationships, or is it based on exploitation and extraction? Are we living in right relationship with the ecosystems upon which we depend and with each other? But what the Zapatistas say is the perspective I take, a pluriversal perspective, a world where many worlds fit. Because indigenous peoples and land-based peoples all over the planet, beginning with our origins in Africa up to this day, have organized themselves in many diverse ways based on, and developed cultures and cosmologies based on being in right relationship to living systems. And I think the way we engage these unequal power dynamics, I mean, one really important thing is to make them visible. An important part of narrative work on climate and on social justice, on any issues, advocacy journalism is about making the invisible visible. It's about making the invisible visible. In the first 3 months of the pandemic, from January to March, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, made $25 billion of personal wealth. That's more than the entire economy of Honduras. And the vast majority of people on the planet have no idea. And the vast majority of people in the United States have no idea, let alone people all over the world who are impacted by this scale of exploitation. Right? Our role, our job as storytellers and advocacy journalists is to make the invisible visible, to expose those power dynamics so that people can get organized and confronted, and also to make visible the confrontations that people are already having around those power dynamics, right? In the United States, we have a story that gets told all the time, this story that Lincoln freed the slaves. You know, Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln freed the slaves, Lincoln freed the slaves. That story makes invisible the fact that actually slave rebellion freed the slaves. That it was the resistance to enslavement that created the conditions that liberated Haiti, and that led in large part to the untenability of enslavement in America. But that story isn't visible because the culture holds a different story that codifies it in the Constitution and gives us a white savior and tells us that the government is legitimate. Okay, I want to get to this other questions. The level of awareness about climate change and commitments to addressing it as gain momentum globally, but unfortunately countries like Nigeria still find it important to increase investment in fossil fuel projects. Yes, this is the double bind, right? Nigeria has an economy entirely dependent on oil, an economy imposed on it, right? Like it wasn't like Nigeria woke up one day and said, "Hey, we have all this oil. What a great way to build our economy," right? Oil was discovered in Nigeria in 1951, and then was followed almost immediately by 60 years of military dictatorship installed by the oil industry in order to maintain control over the oil fields and the degradation of living systems. So I do think this is where there's some like real intertwined complexity that needs to happen. On one hand, campaigns across the world, but particularly in the West, going after the fossil fuel industry is essential, and getting policies and the way in which in the over-consuming world, we develop strategies to reduce and redistribute resources is one important part of it. And for us to do that, we have to remake economy. The other important part of that on the ground in Nigeria is to develop strategies that uplift, amplify traditional economic activity, and that are working to build community wealth in a way that breaks the dependence on the fossil fuel industry, whether it's Shell or Chevron or Total Fina Elf or any of those companies. And that's not an easy project by any stretch of the imagination. But I often argue that our role in the United States is to become ungovernable. But the only way to effectively be ungovernable is to effectively self-govern. And the only way to effectively self-govern is to actually develop economic activity that meets people's needs in such a way that breaks our dependence on the extractive economy. And that is a new kind of organizing. Instead of just fighting against what we don't want, we have to live into the world we know we need. And that is like at the heart of agroecology. That is at the heart, of peasant organizing and peasant food systems, of the cooperative movement, of creating local community-controlled energy cooperatives. All of those things are about building local economy that breaks the dependence on extractivism. And that is not an easy thing. And we'd have to intervene at every scale. Like, I'm emphasizing bottom-up organizing, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be intervening at policy scales to devolve resources to communities where they can get organized in a different way. Assistant value, community asset, right? It is a fundamental difference. A community being informed. Yeah, absolutely. This is the thing about another key principle is this notion of free, prior, and informed consent. And that's a really important concept, that communities have the right to know and the right to say no. And that's often just, again, railroaded by corporate interests with the support of government. So I think there's an enormous amount of culture shift that's required, and part of the narrative work is about that culture shift. And I think an important part of it, an expression I like to use, is this idea of remembering our way forward. So that idea that it isn't about going back to some way of being that was in the past, but it's about remembering that there's a different way we can live and organize, and taking that wisdom into thinking about the future to navigate a different way forward. And that does require a culture shift. It does require exposing, like living and working and organizing in communities to uplift the traditional values that can sometimes anchor us in opposition. What were the ways that we met our needs prior to the oil industry? It's not that long ago. It's not like we can't remember that. What it means to be fishing communities, and then what does it take to restore the ecosystems that we depend on and that we are a part of, right? The mangroves, forests of the Niger Delta are as much a function of human activity as they support human activity through fishing and traditional economy, right? They're co-created with human communities. And I'm sorry, you know, there aren't any simple, easy answers, of course, but I do think an important part of it is the kind of uplifting of values and culture shift that that you all get to engage in as writers, as journalists, as advocates. And I think with that, I should probably, yeah, stop, because I think I'm over time. I hope that was okay, Nasreen, and helpful.
No, that was great. I really like that you took your time to respond to all of the questions. And thank you very much. We are way ahead of time, but I mean, that's really okay. So I was just thinking, maybe if I can just unmute the participants that, you know, are live, in case they would like to add a few more comments, then we just round it up. So we have, yeah, if there's anybody that would like to come in, that would be great.
Hi, Dr. Gopal. How are you?
Hello.
My name is Khalid. I'm actually also from Africa, from South Africa, and familiar with the problems that's occurring in Nigeria and throughout the developed world. I loved your reframing of environmental issues. How I got into the field was fighting the oil corporations here in South Africa, by the by. And over time, you know, it's great being part of this because we can align the interests of what would I call us? Activists, youth, the left, all of these kind of interests, just to see that they are on board and in the same place gives us like a hope for the future, because we arrived here analogously. We arrived at this position in this group, in this conversation, just naturally, organically. No one forced us to be, and this to me represents that easy answer you're looking for. It's kind of the praxis. It's the people forming their communities using the platforms available to them. And yeah, I am totally into changing the economic system and things like that, and not towards eco-fascism, more along eco-communism or something like that. So thank you so much for enlightening us today, and yeah, hope to hear more.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, a frame that I think is really helpful, particularly in the African context, but even globally, is to contrast climate, like we talk about climate justice versus eco-apartheid, because I think as conditions become more severe, the question is how equitably will we distribute the consequences of climate disruption? And dominant forces would love nothing more than to concentrate the consequences in us among a class of people that they can paint as disposable, and that would be the eco-apartheid frame. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the kind words and your contributions.
All right, then, if there isn't much comment, I think we are ready to round up. Overall, I think it was very, very good conversation. And I like that there was lots of interaction in the chat, which means that we're talking about the right thing. So thank you very much, Gopal, for joining us today. Khalid, Yusuf, and many other people that joined and dropped. Thank you very much. Truly appreciate that. I would also add that this is our last session of the environmental report. We're rounding up this series for the year until next year. So truly appreciate all the people that have joined us throughout this 5-part series. And thank you, Gopal, once again for making the time to come on board. Always inspirational to hear you speak. Truly amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Me too.
Thank
So,
you.